Welcome to Listening History Sleepy. Tonight we journey not to the empire of conquest alone, but to the empire of order, to the mind that understood that taking the world was simpler than organizing it, that victory in battle was easier than creating systems that would sustain power across generations and continents. We enter the world of Darius I, who called himself King of Kings, who ruled from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, who commanded territories so vast that the sun never set on his domains. But Darius was not merely conqueror, was something rarer, something more difficult to achieve, was organizer, was administrator, was the intelligence that understood that empire required not just armies but systems, not just power but infrastructure, not just domination but organization. We begin our journey in 522 BCE, when chaos threatened to consume the empire that Cyrus the Great had founded and Cambyses had expanded. The throne was contested. Rebellions erupted across the provinces. The empire that had seemed invincible appeared ready to fragment into the separate kingdoms it had absorbed. Into this crisis stepped Darius, member of the royal family but not direct heir, claiming the throne through combination of force and political maneuvering, suppressing rebellions, restoring order, establishing legitimacy through achievement when birth had not provided it. But what Darius built was not merely restored empire, was transformed empire. Was the creation of systems that would outlast him, roads and messengers, provinces and administrators, laws and taxes, standards and measures, the patient work of organization that turned conquered territories into functioning whole. Was the vision that understood empire as machine requiring maintenance, as organism requiring circulation, as structure requiring foundation. The vision was not romantic, was practical. Was understanding that glory fades but systems persist, that monuments crumble but organization can be inherited, that what matters is not the spectacular but the sustainable. Tonight we will not rush. We'll move slowly through the world Darius organized. We'll examine the cliff where he carved his justification in 3 languages. We'll walk the royal road where messengers ran. We'll climb the stairs at Persepolis that led to the throne of the King of Kings. We'll sit with scribes who counted everything. We'll sail the canal that joined 2 seas. We'll contemplate the systems that made the vast empire manageable, the organization that transformed chaos into order, the administrative genius that created infrastructure lasting long after the empire itself fell. The story of Darius is the story of human capacity for organization, of what intelligence and will can accomplish when applied not to single dramatic achievement, but to the patient work of building systems. It is the story of how power is sustained rather than how it is seized. Is the meditation on order and its limits, on organization and its eventual dissolution, on the empire that was built so brilliantly and that fell so completely, leaving behind echoes that still teach us about what it means to build, to organize, to create structures that outlast their creators. So settle now into the evening. Let the day's concerns release gently. And let us enter the world where Darius organized silence into speech, chaos into order, conquered territories into administered provinces, the vast into the manageable, the diverse into the united, the temporary into something that aspired to permanence even though permanence proved impossible. The journey begins, the empire waits. And somewhere in the ruins where organization once triumphed, the echo still speaks softly about what was built and what remains. High on the limestone cliff at Behistun, where the ancient road from Babylon to Ecbatana curved beneath mountains that touched the sky, where travelers looked up briefly before continuing their journeys through the empire's heart, there remains carved into the living rock an inscription that was never meant to be read, not by human eyes at least, not by travelers passing below. Not by anyone who lacked wings or divine nature or the recklessness to climb 300 feet of sheer stone face where no handhold promised safety, and every movement risked the fall that would end in the rocks below. The inscription speaks in 3 languages. Old Persian first, the language of the ruling Achaemenid dynasty, the tongue that Darius himself spoke when giving orders that would be carried across continents. Elamite second, the ancient language of Susa, the administrative language that clerks and scribes employed when recording the empire's daily business. Akkadian third, the Babylonian language that had dominated Mesopotamia for millennia, the tongue of merchants and scholars, of texts carved into clay when writing was still young miracle. The 3 languages told one story: Darius's story, his version of how he came to power, his justification for the throne he claimed. The text begins, "I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries containing all kinds of men, king in this great earth far and wide." The proclamation continues, listing his lineage, his divine mandate, his victories over the rebels who rose when the previous king died, his suppression of the chaos that threatened to tear the empire apart. The relief carved above the text shows Darius life-sized, his foot upon the prostrate body of Gaumata, the usurper who claimed to be Bardia, son of Cyrus but whom Darius declared was impostor, was Magian priest who seized the throne through deception. Behind the fallen usurper, 9 rebel kings stand bound and connected by rope around their necks, their heads bowed, their defeat made permanent in stone. Above Darius, the winged figure of Ahura Mazda hovers, the Zoroastrian god extending his hand in blessing, confirming divine approval of Darius's kingship, proclaiming that the order Darius restored was sacred order, was alignment of earthly power with heavenly truth. But why so high? Why carve this proclamation where none could read it without risking death? The question echoes across 25 centuries, finds no certain answer, leaves only speculation and the whisper of possibilities. Perhaps the height made the inscription sacred, made it message meant for gods rather than humans, made it proclamation to heaven rather than to earth. Perhaps the inaccessibility made it permanent, placed it beyond reach of those who might deface it, might chip away the lies they said it told, might try to erase the history Darius inscribed. Or perhaps, and this explanation feels closest to truth though truth remains unknowable, perhaps the height was the point. Was demonstration that Darius's power could carve stone where humans could not reach, could proclaim his version of history in place where no one could respond, could write truth that was literally above contradiction. The inscription was not meant to be read but to exist to testify that Darius had spoken, that his words would outlast all who doubted them, that his story was carved into the earth's bones where time itself could not erase it. The irony is that the inscription was forgotten. The languages died. The script became mysterious marks that no one could decipher. The empire fell. Alexander conquered, the Seleucids ruled, the Parthians came, the Sassanids rose, Islam arrived, centuries accumulated like dust, and the inscription remained, speaking to no one, proclaiming to the wind and the eagles, telling its story in tongues that none remembered. Until 1835, when a British officer named Henry Rawlinson, serving in Persia, heard local legends about writing on the cliff, climbed the impossible stone, copied the inscriptions at risk of his life, began the patient work of decipherment that would unlock the ancient languages, that would allow Darius's voice to speak again after silence of millennia. Now we can read what Darius carved, can know his version of history, can hear his justification for power. But we can also see what the inscription conceals: the violence of his rise, the killed rivals, the suppressed rebellions, the possibility that what he called restoration others experienced as usurpation. The cliff speaks in three tongues but hides in its silence the voices that contradicted it, the stories that challenged Darius's claim, the questions about legitimacy that the height of the inscription could place beyond response but could not place beyond existence. Standing below the cliff, looking up at the inscription that was never meant to be read by earthbound eyes, we contemplate what it means when power carves its version of truth into unreachable stone. We wonder what Darius feared that required such proclamation. We ask what the need to proclaim so insistently reveals about the certainty of what is proclaimed. The cliff speaks still in three tongues, telling one story, hiding countless others, remaining as the monument to Darius's determination that his truth would be the truth that survived, that his voice would be the voice that time preserved, that his story would be carved so high and so permanently that none could erase it even if all could doubt it. The inscription endures. The languages have been unlocked. The story can be read. But the questions remain questions about legitimacy and power, about truth and propaganda, about what we can know from monuments that proclaim too loudly, about what silence hides behind the three-tongued voice that still speaks from the cliff where Darius carved his name and his justification into stone that would outlast empire, that would survive conquest, that would testify across centuries, that here, in this moment that the inscription tries to make eternal. Darius claimed the throne and proclaimed that gods had chosen him, that rebels had fallen before him, that order had been restored through him, that the empire would remember him as the great king, the king of kings, the one whose voice spoke in three tongues from unreachable stone, proclaiming forever the truth that power needed others to believe was truth, carving into the cliff the story that would survive when all who knew different were silent, when all who challenged were defeated. When the only voice that remained was the voice that spoke from stone, in three tongues from heights where none could answer, where the proclamation could exist unchallenged except by time and silence and the eternal questions that monuments always raise. What truth requires such insistence, and what does the insistence reveal about the truth proclaimed? In the darkness before dawn, when night held the empire in its grip and stars wheeled overhead in patterns that the Magi read as messages from divine realms, the fires burned. In temples scattered from Sardis to Bactria, from the Aegean coast to the edges of India, the eternal flames were tended by priests who had inherited their knowledge across generations, who understood that the fire they maintained was not merely light against darkness but was the visible presence of Ahura Mazda in the world, was the element that connected earth to heaven, was the sacred flame that must never be allowed to die because its extinguishing would signal the triumph of chaos over order, of falsehood over truth, of the darkness that surrounded everything over the light that gave meaning to existence. Darius was Zoroastrian, was devotee of Ahura Mazda the wise lord, understood his kingship as service to the cosmic struggle between Asha truth, order, righteousness, and drudge falsehood, chaos, disorder. The religion was not merely personal conviction but was framework for understanding empire itself, for comprehending what the great king was meant to accomplish. The empire Darius organized was theological vision made manifest in political form, was attempt to impose divine order on human affairs, to create on earth the harmony that existed in the heavenly realm, to make civilization itself into reflection of cosmic truth. The fire temples became more than places of worship. Became administrative centers where priests who served Ahura Mazda also served the king, where religious authority and political power reinforced each other, where the divine order that the flames represented aligned with the imperial order that Darius commanded. The priests who tended the fires also kept records, administered justice, collected taxes, organized the daily work of governing provinces that stretched beyond any previous empire's reach. The separation between sacred and secular did not exist as later ages would understand it. The fire that burned for Ahura Mazda burned also for the empire. The prayers offered to the wise Lord prayed also for the King of Kings. The cosmic order and the political order were understood as reflections of each other, as mutually reinforcing, as inseparable aspects of the same divine plan. The flames themselves were sacred because fire was pure, was the element that consumed impurity, that transformed material substance into light and heat and ash that could not be polluted, that rose naturally upward toward the heavens. Water could be contaminated, earth could be defiled, air could carry miasma, but fire remained pure through its nature, burned away corruption, existed as perpetual purification. The priests who tended the flames maintained elaborate rituals to prevent pollution, kept their faces covered so that breath would not contaminate the fire, used specialized tools to add fuel so that hands would not touch the sacred flame, followed procedures that had been perfected across centuries to ensure that the eternal fire remained pure as it remained eternal. But the fires also spoke to each other across the distances. When a new temple was consecrated, its fire was kindled from the fire of an existing temple, carrying the sacred flame across space, creating network of fires that were connected through their origin, that shared the same divine spark, that testified to the unity underlying the empire's diversity. The fire in Persepolis was kindled from the fire in Pasargadae. The fire in Susa shared spark with the fire in Ecbatana. The flames burning in distant Bactria or Egypt carried within them the same divine light that burned in the empire's heart. The network of fires became metaphor for the empire itself, diverse locations connected through shared origin, distinct flames that were nevertheless manifestations of single light, the many that derived from the one. The cosmic theology that the fires embodied also provided justification for Darius's rule and for his policies. The king was not God. Zoroastrianism was not polytheistic tradition that deified rulers, but the king was chosen by Ahura Mazda to maintain order on earth, to fight against chaos, to ensure that truth prevailed over falsehood. The rebellions that Darius suppressed were not merely political challenges but were manifestations of drudge, were chaos attempting to overcome order, were falsehood trying to defeat truth. Suppressing them was not mere exercise of power but was fulfilling divine mandate, was serving the cosmic struggle, was fighting on behalf of Ahura Mazda against the forces that threatened to plunge the world into disorder. The theology also provided framework for understanding religious diversity within the empire. Zoroastrianism taught that truth was universal, but that different peoples had been given different understandings of truth, that various gods were imperfect apprehensions of the one supreme deity, that respecting diverse forms of worship served the cause of Asha rather than undermining it. This theological position enabled practical tolerance, allowed Darius to rule Babylonians who worshipped Marduk, Egyptians who worshipped Ra, Jews who worshipped Yahweh, Greeks who worshipped their Olympian pantheon. The tolerance was not modern secular indifference, but was rooted in religious conviction that the divine revealed itself in diverse ways, that enforcing uniformity was less important than maintaining the order that allowed different peoples to worship according to their traditions while submitting to Persian authority. In the temples where fires burned through centuries, where priests maintained their vigils, where the flame that was never allowed to die testified to the eternal presence of divine order in the world, we find the sacred foundation of Darius's empire. The organization that he created, the systems that he established, the infrastructure that he built all rested on theological understanding that order was sacred duty, that chaos was enemy to be defeated, that the empire itself was participant in cosmic struggle between light and darkness, between truth and falsehood, between the fire that illuminated and purified and the darkness that surrounded everything, threatening always to extinguish the flame, to return the world to primordial chaos. To undo the organization that Darius had imposed, the fires burned, the priests prayed, the empire functioned. And in the darkness before dawn, when the eternal flames were brightest against the surrounding night, when the cosmic struggle seemed most visible, the fires spoke their wordless sermon. That order must be maintained against chaos, that truth must be defended against falsehood, that the light must be tended carefully lest darkness overwhelm it, that empire, whatever its flaws, whatever violence it required, whatever injustices it perpetrated, was preferable to the chaos that would reign without it. That the fire that ordered the world was worth protecting, worth serving, worth keeping alive across generations, even when the empire that the fire blessed would eventually fall. Even when the order that the fire represented would give way to new disorders, even when the flame itself would be extinguished in some temples while continuing to burn in others, even when the theological certainty that had made empire seem participation in divine plan would be challenged by other certainties, other gods, other understandings of what sacred meant and what order required, and whether the fire that Darius said blessed his rule was truly divine light or was merely flame like any other. Burning without transcendent meaning, offering warmth and illumination but not cosmic significance, persisting through human effort rather than through divine will, speaking only the language that fire speaks, the wordless testimony to the human need for light in darkness, for warmth against cold, for the flame that holds chaos at bay for a while, for a time, for the duration of empire, for as long as someone tends it, keeps it burning, believes that tending it matters. It believes that the fire orders the world rather than merely illuminating small portion of the darkness that surrounds everything, that will eventually claim everything, that waits patiently beyond the fire's reach, in the silence that follows when flames die, when empires fall, when the fire that ordered the world is allowed at last to go out. Across 2,000 miles of desert and mountain, across territories where languages changed and gods wore different faces and customs varied so widely that travelers felt they journeyed not merely through space but through diverse worlds, the royal road ran not merely path worn by feet and hooves but was organized system, was sequence of way stations spaced with mathematical precision, was infrastructure that transformed distance from obstacle into routine, from barrier into connection. The road began at Susa, the administrative capital where Darius spent his winters, where the heat of summer made residence unbearable, but where the season's gentler months allowed the work of governing to proceed in comfort. From Susa the road stretched westward through the Zagros Mountains, descended to the Mesopotamian plain, crossed the Tigris River, continued through what had been the Assyrian heartland, climbed through the passes of the Taurus Mountains, emerged onto the Anatolian plateau, crossed territories that had been Lydian before becoming Persian, and arrived finally at Sardis, the former capital of Lydia that had become capital of the westernmost satrapy. The city from which Persian power extended toward the Aegean coast and the Greek cities that acknowledged Persian authority while maintaining their independence in matters that did not challenge imperial interests. The distance was approximately 1,600 miles by the route the road followed, longer than direct line, but following paths that avoided the worst mountains, that found passes through ranges that would otherwise be impassable, that connected water sources and avoided deserts where survival was uncertain. To walk this distance required months for ordinary travelers, but the royal road was not built for ordinary travel. Was built for the imperial messenger system, for the network of riders who carried communications from the great king to the satrapies and from the satrapies back to the center. Herodotus, the Greek historian who traveled through the Persian Empire and who recorded what he saw with mixture of accuracy and exaggeration, with careful observation and credulous reporting of fantastic stories, described the messenger system with admiration that transcended his Greek prejudice against Persian barbarians. He wrote, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds." The words captured something essential about the system's reliability, about its capacity to function regardless of weather or season, about the dedication of the riders who carried messages that might determine the fate of provinces or armies or peoples. The system worked through relay stations chaparkane in Persian, houses of the couriers spaced 1 day's ride apart along the entire length of the road. At each station, fresh horses waited. Messengers arriving would transfer their sealed messages to fresh riders who would carry them to the next station. The process repeated across the road's length, allowing urgent communications to cross the empire in 7 days rather than the months that ordinary travel required. The speed was unprecedented in ancient world, would not be matched in any empire until much later ages developed their own imperial messenger systems modeled consciously or unconsciously on the Persian precedent. The stations were more than relay points. Were communities unto themselves housed not just the horses and the messengers but their families, the staff who maintained the facilities, the guards who protected the official travelers, the scribes who recorded arrivals and departures. The stations became nodes in the empire's communication network, became places where information accumulated, where travelers met, where news from distant provinces could be learned by those passing through. The road created circulation not just of messages but of people and ideas, not just of official communications but of merchants and pilgrims, not just of imperial administration but of cultural exchange. Walking the road in imagination because the ancient route is lost now, is buried beneath modern highways or has returned to desert, is traceable only through archaeological evidence and the accounts of ancient travelers. We feel the dust beneath feet that have walked this path for 25 centuries. We pass the ruins of stations where messengers once rested. We climb the mountain passes where the road carved through stone. We descend to the river crossings where bridges or ferries once carried travelers from one bank to the other. We walk in the footsteps of messengers carrying the great king's orders, of merchants transporting goods between distant markets, of pilgrims journeying to sacred sites, of armies marching to suppress rebellions or to extend the empire's borders, of all who used this road that Darius built to connect the vast territories he ruled. The road was Darius's genius made visible, was the understanding that empire requires not just conquest but connection, that ruling distant provinces requires knowing what happens there, that control depends on communication, that the size that makes empire powerful also makes it vulnerable unless distances can be overcome. The organization that made the messenger system function, the stations maintained across generations, the horses bred and trained for speed and endurance, the riders selected for skill and reliability, the administrators who managed the entire system, the funds allocated to ensure the system's sustainability all testified to Darius's capacity for systematic thinking, for creating infrastructure that would persist beyond his reign, and for building systems that solved not temporary problems but addressed the permanent challenges of governing territories too vast for any individual to directly oversee. But the road also revealed empire's paradox. The connection that bound the empire could also facilitate its dissolution. The road that carried the king's orders could carry news of the king's weakness. The stations that supported imperial messengers could support rebellious armies. The system that made administration possible made rebellion more coordinated. The infrastructure that created unity could be used to organize resistance to that unity. The road ran in both directions toward the center and away from the center, carrying integration and division, unity and fragmentation, the forces that sustained empire and the forces that would eventually tear it apart. In the empty stations, in the road now lost to time and sand, in the distances that once could be measured in days but that now seem almost inconceivable in their vastness, we find the testimony to human capacity for organization and to organization's limits. The road that measured distance in days made the empire manageable for a time, made communication possible for generations, made the vast territories seem less vast because they could be traversed, could be connected, could be bound together through the circulation that the road enabled. But the road could not prevent the empire's fall, could not make the distances disappear, could only make them manageable for as long as the system was maintained, for as long as the stations were staffed, for as long as riders were willing to risk the journey, for as long as empire lasted. The road remains in memory and in fragments. The stones that paved portions of it lie scattered. The bridges that crossed its rivers have collapsed. The stations that dotted its length have dissolved into the landscape. But the concept persists, the understanding that connection requires infrastructure, that communication requires systems, that vast distances can be overcome through organization, that the road measuring distance in days was achievement as significant as any military victory, as any monument, as any of the more celebrated accomplishments of kings who conquered without understanding that conquest was only beginning. That the real work was building the roads and stations and systems that would make conquest into empire, that would transform military achievement into administrative reality, that would allow the vast to be governed, the diverse to be united, the distant to be connected through the road that measured distance not in miles but in days, not in space but in time, not in the obstacle it presented but in the routine it enabled, the journey it made possible. The connection it established between center and periphery, between power and its exercise, between the great king sitting in Susa and the satrapies that acknowledged his authority because the road made that authority real, made it present, made it something more than distant abstraction, something more than name carved in stone, something more than claim that could be ignored because it seemed so far away. The road brought empire close, made distance manageable, measured the vast in days. and in doing so made Darius's empire possible, made its organization achievable, made its administration functional, made the King of Kings into actual ruler rather than merely titular one, made the empire that stretched from Aegean to Indus into reality that could be governed rather than merely into territory that had been conquered. The road was the empire. The stations were its nerves, the messengers were its voice. And for as long as the system functioned, for as long as the road was maintained, for as long as riders ran through dust carrying messages that bound the provinces to the center, the empire lived, governed, functioned, organized the chaos of vast distances into the order of days measured. Stations reached, messages delivered, communication maintained, connection preserved, until the day when riders stopped running, when stations fell silent. When the road was abandoned to dust and time and the slow dissolution that claims all human infrastructure when the will to maintain it fails. When empire falls, when the organization that made the vast manageable dissolves, when distance returns to being measured in impossibility rather than in days, when the road that connected everything becomes the archaeological curiosity that speaks softly about what was built and what remains, what functioned and what failed, what connected and what now lies scattered. Broken, lost along the road that measured distance in days, that made empire possible, that testified to Darius's genius for organization, that remains now only in fragments and in memory and in the whisper that says, "Once this road connected the world, and for a time, for a while, distance could be measured in days." In the mints scattered across the empire, in the workshops where fire heated metal and hammers struck with rhythmic precision, where skilled craftsmen transformed raw gold into standardized units of value, the Daric was born coin bearing the image of the great king as archer, kneeling with bow drawn and spear in hand, frozen in moment of action that would be repeated millions of times, stamped into countless coins, and distributed across territories so vast that the same image appeared in markets from the Aegean to Central Asia, from Egypt to India, creating through repetition a visual unity that mirrored the political unity Darius claimed. Before the Daric, wealth was diverse and difficult. Was measured in goods that had no standard value, in livestock that might sicken, in grain that might spoil, in metals weighed for each transaction and tested for purity because trust was local and ephemeral, and could not extend beyond face-to-face relationships between people who knew each other. And trade across distances was possible but was complicated, required multiple exchanges, required translating value from one system to another, required the constant negotiations that slowed commerce and limited the scale of economic activity. The Daric changed this. It created abstract value that was guaranteed not by the metal's weight alone, though the coins were pure gold and their weight was carefully standardized, but by the image stamped upon them, by the authority of the king whose likeness appeared on every coin, by the state's promise that this metal represented value that would be honored throughout the empire. The innovation was not unique to Persia. The Lydians had introduced coinage decades earlier, but Darius systematized it, made it imperial policy, created mints throughout his territories, established standards that allowed coins minted in different provinces to circulate freely because their value was guaranteed by central authority rather than by local custom. Holding the Daric in imagination because original examples survive in museums, because we can see the Archer King's image still sharp after 25 centuries, we feel the weight of it. Roughly 8 grams of pure gold, substantial enough to testify to value but small enough to carry and exchange. We see the image struck into the metal's surface, the great king kneeling, his bow drawn, his beard stylized in the Persian manner, his robes detailed despite the coin's small size. The image spoke volumes without words, proclaimed that Persian power extended to this coin, that the king's authority guaranteed its value, that submitting to Persian rule meant participating in an economic system that could make you wealthy if you served imperial interests, that the Archer King was always watching, always ready, always powerful, always present in every transaction conducted with coins bearing his image. The Daric unified the empire's economy as the roads unified its geography. Made trade across vast distances practical because merchants in Sardis and Susa, in Babylon and Bactria, in Memphis and Persepolis all recognized the same value, all accepted the same currency, all participated in market that extended across territories speaking different languages and practicing different customs. The economic integration reinforced political integration, made provinces economically dependent on the empire, made prosperity contingent on maintaining order, made merchants and traders into stakeholders in imperial stability because chaos would disrupt the trade that enriched them. But the coin also created vulnerabilities that had not existed before. Created the possibility that economic crisis could spread across the empire as quickly as coins circulated. It created dependence on maintaining the coin's value, on ensuring that people continued to trust that the gold stamped with the Archer King's image would be accepted in distant markets, that the state's guarantee was reliable. If confidence failed, if people began to doubt that the coins would be honored, that the value they represented was real, that the empire backing them was stable, the entire system could collapse. The coins would remain gold, would retain metal's intrinsic value, but would lose the additional value that came from the state's guarantee, would revert to being merely metal weighed and tested for each transaction. The Daric also represented abstraction in ways that barter economy never did. It created separation between goods and their value, made wealth into something that could be accumulated in form that did not spoil or sicken or die, made possible for individuals to become wealthy in ways that had been difficult when wealth was livestock and grain. The abstraction enabled new forms of economic activity, enabled lending and borrowing, enabled long-distance trade on unprecedented scale, enabled accumulation of capital that could be invested in enterprises requiring resources beyond what any individual could provide through goods alone. We contemplate the Archer King stamped in gold, repeated millions of times, distributed across an empire, carrying imperial authority into every market and transaction. The image was propaganda as much as currency was constant reminder of who ruled, was visual assertion of power that appeared in contexts having nothing to do with politics but everything to do with economy, was the king making himself present in the most mundane interactions, in the daily exchanges that constituted ordinary life. The Daric was not merely economic tool but was ideological instrument, was means of making Persian rule seem natural and necessary, was way of binding subjects to empire through self-interest rather than through force alone. In museums where Darics rest behind glass, where the Archer-King's image remains crisp despite millennia, where the gold gleams as it gleamed when first struck, we see the durability of metal contrasted with the impermanence of the empire that minted it. The coins survived. The empire fell, the gold persisted, the guarantee dissolved. The coins were melted down and reforged into the currencies of empires that came after Alexander's coins, the drachmas of Seleucids, the coins of Parthians and Sassanids, of caliphs and shahs, each empire transforming Persian gold into its own currency, stamping its own images onto metal that had once borne the Archer-King's likeness. The Daric that spoke in gold spoke of value and power, of economy and empire, of the systems Darius created to make vast territories function as economic unit. But the Daric also speaks of impermanence, of how systems depend on trust, how value is social agreement rather than physical property, how the coin was worth more than its gold only while the empire existed to guarantee that worth, how the speaking stopped when empire fell, how the gold remained but the voice went silent, how the Archer-King became merely image on metal rather than guarantee of value. How the coin that unified an empire became historical artifact testifying to the empire's fall, to the impermanence of even carefully organized systems, to the limit of what organization can achieve, to the truth that the coin spoke in gold but that gold cannot speak forever, cannot preserve the empire whose image it bears, cannot prevent the dissolution that eventually claims all human institutions regardless of how much gold backs them, how carefully their value is guaranteed, how widely they circulate, how fundamental they seem to the functioning of the economy, how permanent they appear while empire lasts, how quickly they lose their special value when empire falls and gold becomes merely gold again, valuable for itself but no longer speaking in the voice of the Archer-King, no longer carrying imperial authority, no longer unifying territories through shared currency, no longer binding provinces through economic integration. No longer speaking silent now except in museums where the images remain, where the gold gleams, where the coins testify to what was built and what dissolved, what spoke and what fell silent, what unified and what scattered, what Darius created and what time unmade, what the coin said when empire lasted and what the silence says now that empire has fallen, now that the Daric has ceased speaking except to whisper about value and its impermanence, about gold and its endurance. About the voice that spoke from coins that circulated across an empire and that speaks now only from fragments displayed behind glass, speaking softly, speaking sadly, speaking the truth that all currencies eventually speak. That value is consensus, that consensus dissolves, that gold remains when everything else fades, that the coin that spoke in gold speaks now only in silence, in the quiet of museums where the Archer King's image persists without the empire that gave it meaning, without the guarantee that made it more than metal, without the voice that once spoke with authority from every coin, every transaction, every moment when gold changed hands bearing the image that said, "This is value, this is power, this is the empire speaking in the universal language of wealth, this is Darius guaranteeing worth, this is the system functioning until the day when it stopped functioning, when the guarantee ceased, when the coins became merely gold, beautiful still, valuable still, but silent now, speaking only through their silence about value lost, about empire fallen, about the Derek that spoke in gold but that speaks now only in memory, in fragments. In the whispering gold that outlasted the voice that once spoke through it. In the mints scattered across the empire, in the workshops where fire heated metal and hammers struck with rhythmic precision, where skilled craftsmen transformed raw gold into standardized units of value, the Daric was born coin bearing the image of the great king as archer, kneeling with bow drawn and spear in hand, frozen in moment of action that would be repeated millions of times, stamped into countless coins, and distributed across territories so vast that the same image appeared in markets from the Aegean to Central Asia, from Egypt to India, creating through repetition a visual unity that mirrored the political unity Darius claimed. Before the Daric, wealth was diverse and difficult. Was measured in goods that had no standard value, in livestock that might sicken, in grain that might spoil, in metals weighed for each transaction, and tested for purity because trust was local and ephemeral, and could not extend beyond face-to-face relationships between people who knew each other. And trade across distances was possible but was complicated, required multiple exchanges, required translating value from one system to another, required the constant negotiations that slowed commerce and limited the scale of economic activity. The Daric changed this. It created abstract value that was guaranteed not by the metal's weight alone, though the coins were pure gold and their weight was carefully standardized, but by the image stamped upon them, by the authority of the king whose likeness appeared on every coin, by the state's promise that this metal represented value that would be honored throughout the empire. The innovation was not unique to Persia. The Lydians had introduced coinage decades earlier, but Darius systematized it, made it imperial policy, created mints throughout his territories, established standards that allowed coins minted in different provinces to circulate freely, because their value was guaranteed by central authority rather than by local custom. Holding the Daric in imagination because original examples survive in museums, because we can see the Archer King's image still sharp after 25 centuries, we feel the weight of it. Roughly 8 grams of pure gold, substantial enough to testify to value but small enough to carry and exchange. We see the image struck into the metal's surface, the great king kneeling, his bow drawn, his beard stylized in the Persian manner, his robes detailed despite the coin's small size. The image spoke volumes without words. proclaimed that Persian power extended to this coin, that the king's authority guaranteed its value, that submitting to Persian rule meant participating in an economic system that could make you wealthy if you served imperial interests, that the archer-king was always watching, always ready, always powerful, always present in every transaction conducted with coins bearing his image. The Daric unified the empire's economy as the roads unified its geography. Made trade across vast distances practical because merchants in Sardis and Susa, in Babylon and Bactria, in Memphis and Persepolis all recognized the same value, all accepted the same currency, all participated in market that extended across territories speaking different languages and practicing different customs. The economic integration reinforced political integration, made provinces economically dependent on the empire, made prosperity contingent on maintaining order, made merchants and traders into stakeholders in imperial stability because chaos would disrupt the trade that enriched them. But the coin also created vulnerabilities that had not existed before. Created the possibility that economic crisis could spread across the empire as quickly as coins circulated. It created dependence on maintaining the coin's value, on ensuring that people continued to trust that the gold stamped with the archer-king's image would be accepted in distant markets, that the state's guarantee was reliable. If confidence failed, if people began to doubt that the coins would be honored, that the value they represented was real, that the empire backing them was stable, the entire system could collapse. The coins would remain gold, would retain metal's intrinsic value, but would lose the additional value that came from the state's guarantee, would revert to being merely metal weighed and tested for each transaction. The Daric also represented abstraction in ways that barter economy never did. It created separation between goods and their value, made wealth into something that could be accumulated in form that did not spoil or sicken or die, made possible for individuals to become wealthy in ways that had been difficult when wealth was livestock and grain. The abstraction enabled new forms of economic activity, enabled lending and borrowing, enabled long-distance trade on unprecedented scale, enabled accumulation of capital that could be invested in enterprises requiring resources beyond what any individual could provide through goods alone. We contemplate the archer-king stamped in gold, repeated millions of times, distributed across an empire, carrying imperial authority into every market and transaction. The image was propaganda as much as currency, was constant reminder of who ruled, was visual assertion of power that appeared in contexts having nothing to do with politics but everything to do with economy, was the king making himself present in the most mundane interactions, in the daily exchanges that constituted ordinary life. The Daric was not merely economic tool but was ideological instrument, was means of making Persian rule seem natural and necessary, was way of binding subjects to empire through self-interest rather than through force alone. In museums where Darics rest behind glass, where the archer-king's image remains crisp despite millennia, where the gold gleams as it gleamed when first struck, we see the durability of metal contrasted with the impermanence of the empire that minted it. The coins survived. The empire fell, the gold persisted, the guarantee dissolved. The coins were melted down and reforged into the currencies of empires that came after Alexander's coins, the drachmas of Seleucids, the coins of Parthians and Sassanids, of caliphs and shahs, each empire transforming Persian gold into its own currency, stamping its own images onto metal that had once borne the Archer King's likeness. The Daric that spoke in gold spoke of value and power, of economy and empire, of the systems Darius created to make vast territories function as economic unit. But the Daric also speaks of impermanence, of how systems depend on trust, how value is social agreement rather than physical property, how the coin was worth more than its gold only while the empire existed to guarantee that worth, how the speaking stopped when empire fell, how the gold remained but the voice went silent, how the Archer King became merely image on metal rather than guarantee of value, how the coin that unified an empire became historical artifact testifying to the empire's fall, to the impermanence of even carefully organized systems, to the limit of what organization can achieve, to the truth that the coin spoke in gold but that gold cannot speak forever, cannot preserve the empire whose image it bears, cannot prevent the dissolution that eventually claims all human institutions regardless of how much gold backs them, how carefully their value is guaranteed, how widely they circulate, how fundamental they seem to the functioning of the economy, how permanent they appear while empire lasts, how quickly they lose their special value when empire falls and gold becomes merely gold again, valuable for itself but no longer speaking in the voice of the Archer King, no longer carrying imperial authority, no longer unifying territories through shared currency, no longer binding provinces through economic integration. No longer speaking silent now except in museums where the images remain, where the gold gleams, where the coins testify to what was built and what dissolved, what spoke and what fell silent, what unified and what scattered, what Darius created and what time unmade, what the coin said when empire lasted and what the silence says now that empire has fallen, now that the Daric has ceased speaking except to whisper about value and its impermanence, about gold and its endurance, about the voice that spoke from coins that circulated across an empire and that speaks now only from fragments displayed behind glass, speaking softly, speaking sadly, speaking the truth that all currencies eventually speak. That value is consensus, that consensus dissolves, that gold remains when everything else fades, that the coin that spoke in gold speaks now only in silence, in the quiet of museums where the Archer King's image persists without the empire that gave it meaning, without the guarantee that made it more than metal, without the voice that once spoke with authority from every coin, every transaction, every moment when gold changed hands bearing the image that said, "This is value, this is power, this is the empire speaking in the universal language of wealth, this is Darius guaranteeing worth, this is the system functioning until the day when it stopped functioning, when the guarantee ceased, when the coins became merely gold, beautiful still, valuable still, but silent now, speaking only through their silence about value lost, about empire fallen, about the Derek that spoke in gold but that speaks now only in memory, in fragments. In the whispering gold that outlasted the voice that once spoke through it. Chapter 5, the satraps who ruled like kings in each of the 20 satrapies, the provinces into which Darius divided his empire, each vast enough to be kingdom in its own right, each governed by a satrap whose title meant protector of the kingdom, but whose power approached kingship itself. A delicate balance was maintained, a tension between autonomy and control that defined the empire's functioning, that made governance possible while containing the dangers that delegation always creates. The satrap was almost king within his province, commanded armies sufficient to maintain order and to defend against external threats, collected taxes according to formulas that Darius established, formulas that assigned each satrap a fixed annual tribute based on the province's population and resources, administered justice, hearing cases that local courts could not resolve, issuing rulings in the great king's name. Maintained court that in its splendor and ceremony rivaled the royal court itself. Lived in palaces whose architecture proclaimed power, whose treasuries held wealth that could finance small kingdoms. But the satrap was watched, was never allowed to forget that his power was delegated, was granted by the King of Kings and could be revoked by the King of Kings, was contingent on loyalty that had to be continuously demonstrated because suspicion of disloyalty could mean dismissal or death. The watching took many forms, created redundant systems of oversight that made rebellion difficult and coordination between satraps almost impossible. The king's eyes and ears, the royal inspectors who traveled without warning through the satrapies, who arrived at the satrap's palace with authority to investigate anything, who reported directly to the great king, who could override the satrap's orders, who represented the center's authority penetrating into the provinces, appeared unpredictably, ensuring that satraps could never relax their vigilance, could never assume that what they did in distant provinces would remain unknown to the king they supposedly served. The garrison commanders who led the royal troops stationed in each satrapy reported through separate chain of command, answered to military officials who answered to the king rather than to the satrap. The division meant that satraps commanded provincial forces but could not command the royal garrisons that were stationed ostensibly to defend the province, but that also served to ensure the satrap's loyalty. If a satrap rebelled, the royal garrison would oppose him, would become the nucleus around which loyal forces could gather. The secretaries who managed the satrapal administration, who kept the records and wrote the reports, often answered to the central bureaucracy, sent copies of documents to the king's officials, created paper trail that allowed the center to monitor the province's affairs without relying on the satrap's reports alone. The scribes were empire's memory, were the means by which the center knew what happened in provinces so distant that direct knowledge was impossible. We enter the satrap's palace in imagination, perhaps at Sardis or Babylon, at Memphis or Bactria, at any of the provincial capitals where satrap held court. We walk through halls where petitioners waited, where nobles came to offer respects or to request favors, where the satrap's authority was made visible through architectural grandeur and ceremonial display. We see the throne where the satrap sat to receive visitors, elevated but not as elevated as the great king's throne, proclaiming authority but acknowledging that greater authority existed elsewhere. We witness the audience where provincial officials reported, where messengers brought news from distant parts of the satrapy, where the satrap gave orders that would affect thousands of lives but that could be overruled by word from Susa or Persepolis. The satrap's life was constrained luxury, was power hedged by limitations, was authority that came with constant awareness of being watched, of reports being compiled, of the king's judgment being formed from information the satrap might never see, from accusations the satrap might never hear, from suspicions that could end in sudden summons to the royal court where dismissal or execution might wait. The great satraps, those who governed major provinces, who controlled significant resources, who commanded substantial armies, were especially vulnerable because their power made them especially dangerous, made them potential rebels if they chose rebellion, made them threats that required constant monitoring. Yet rebellion did occur. Satraps did test their limits, did attempt to make their provinces independent, did coordinate with other satraps when they perceived the center weakening. The system Darius created limited but could not eliminate the dangers of delegation. The organizational genius that distributed power to make the vast empire governable also created the structures through which empire could fragment if central authority weakened. The satrap who was loyal today might rebel tomorrow if circumstances changed, if the great king died and succession was contested, if military defeat suggested that Persian power was declining. Darius understood these dangers. He created the redundant oversight systems precisely because he knew that satraps would pursue their interests, that loyalty was contingent on the center appearing strong enough to punish disloyalty, that the balance between autonomy and control had to be continuously maintained through a combination of rewards for loyalty and credible threats against rebellion. The genius was not eliminating the dangers but managing them, not preventing ambitious satraps from existing, but preventing them from successfully rebelling, not making delegation safe, but making it safer than the alternative of trying to rule everything from the center. In the ruins of the satrapal palaces, in the empty throne rooms where satraps once held court, in the silence that has claimed the provinces where power once concentrated in hands of men who ruled like kings while knowing they were not kings, we contemplate the paradox of delegation. Empire required sharing power to maintain power, required giving satraps enough authority to govern effectively but not enough to rebel successfully. Required trust that could never be complete because complete trust would create vulnerability. Required systems of oversight that acknowledged that human nature made betrayal possible, that self-interest might override loyalty, that the satrap protecting the kingdom might decide that protecting himself required abandoning or even opposing the king he served. The balance was never perfect, was always in tension, always required adjustment. He always threatened to collapse into either tyranny if the center trusted no one and tried to control everything directly, or fragmentation if the center trusted too much and allowed satraps too much autonomy. Darius walked the line between these dangers, created system that lasted for generations, established precedent that later empires would study and adapt, made possible the governance of territories so vast that no previous ruler had successfully administered them. The satraps who ruled like kings were essential to empire's functioning, were Darius's lieutenants in the work of organizing chaos, were the hands and eyes through which the King of Kings touched distant provinces and knew their conditions, were the voices through which imperial authority spoke in languages Darius did not speak, in contexts Darius could not directly access, were the balance between center and periphery, between unity and diversity, between imperial authority and local autonomy, between the one who ruled everything in name and the many who ruled portions in fact, between the great king whose authority was absolute in theory and the satraps whose power was substantial in practice, between the system that Darius created and the reality that the system had to accommodate, between the order that organization imposed and the chaos that always threatened to return when attention lapsed, when oversight failed, when the satrap who protected the kingdom decided that the kingdom he would protect was his own, not the king's, that the loyalty he owed was to himself first and to the distant monarch second, that the balance had shifted and the time had come to test whether the King of Kings could truly enforce his will in provinces that lay months of travel from the royal court, whether the systems of oversight could prevent what ambition attempted, whether the empire Darius organized could survive the very delegation that made organization possible, whether the satraps who ruled like kings would remember they were not kings or would forget in the distance, and the power and the temptation to believe that the province they governed might become the kingdom they ruled, that the protection they owed might be claimed for themselves, that the empire might fragment along the lines that Darius himself had drawn when he created the satrapies, when he made the maps, when he delegated the power, when he created the system that made empire manageable but that also made empire vulnerable, that organized the chaos but that planted within the organization the seeds of its own dissolution, that gave satraps power they needed to govern but power that could turn against the giver, that balanced autonomy and control for as long as the balance could be maintained, for as long as the center remained strong, for as long as the system functioned as designed, for as long as empire lasted. On the plain beneath the mountains where spring came gently and brought green to the desert brown, where the air was thin and clear, and every distant peak stood sharp against the sky, Darius built Persepolis, not merely capital but sacred space, not merely palace but temple, not merely residence but stage for theater of power that would make Persian majesty visible to all who climbed the stairs that led upward toward the throne of the King of Kings. the great stairway approaches from the plain. Rises gradually. Was designed with such subtle calculation that the climb feels effortless, each step shallow enough that ascending comes naturally, that the effort of climbing disappears into the rhythm of walking, that arriving at the top comes almost as surprise when suddenly one finds oneself not on the plain but on the platform, not at ground level but elevated, not approaching the palace but standing before it, transformed through architecture from subject into suppliant, through elevation from citizen into petitioner. Through the simple act of climbing stairs into participant in ritual whose meaning was the stairs themselves, whose message was the ascent, whose purpose was making the climber understand through the body's movement what words might not convey. That approaching the great king required rising upward, that Persian power existed on different level from ordinary life, that the distance between subject and sovereign was vertical rather than merely horizontal. The reliefs carved along the stairs show the empire's diversity made into procession, show delegations from every province climbing the same stairs we climb in imagination. The Medes bring horses, the Armenians bring wine vessels, the Babylonians bring textiles, the Indians bring gold, the Ethiopians bring ivory and animals, the Lydians bring bowls and bracelets. 23 delegations proceed eternally upward in stone, carrying tribute to the king who waits above, participating in ritual that happened annually during the spring festival but that the reliefs make eternal, that transform the Ansarli ceremony into permanent testimony to empire's reach, to the diversity that Persian power united, to the many peoples who climbed these stairs bearing gifts that acknowledged submission while displaying their culture's achievements. The carvings serve pedagogical purpose. The climbing delegations see themselves depicted in the reliefs, see their own peoples represented in the eternal procession, recognize their costumes and their gifts, understand that they are not merely individuals climbing stairs but are representatives participating in ceremony that has been performed before and will be performed again, that their submission is part of pattern larger than themselves, that their peoples have been integrated into empire whose extent the stairs make visible through showing so many delegations from so many territories climbing toward the same throne. At the top of the stairs, the Apadana waits the audience hall where the great king sat enthroned to receive the tribute, where the ceremony climaxed in the moment when each delegation presented its gifts, when the king acknowledged their submission and their offerings. The hall was vast, could hold 10,000 people. Was forest of columns rising 70 feet to support roof that covered nearly 10,000 square meters. The scale made humans small, made the individual feel insignificant against the architectural proclamation of power that could command resources to build on such scale, that could organize labor to accomplish what seemed impossible, that could create space vast enough that the king receiving tribute appeared distant even to those who had climbed the stairs to approach him. The columns themselves carried meaning, were carved with capitals showing bulls and lions and eagles, animals representing strength and power and divine favor. The decoration transformed structural elements into symbolic statements, made the architecture speak about the nature of Persian authority, about the divine blessing that supported the king's rule, about the power that could subdue even the strongest animals and make them serve decorative purposes in royal palace. But Persepolis was more than power's theater, was also administrative center, was palace complex housing treasuries and armories, archives and storerooms, quarters for officials and servants, the infrastructure that allowed empire to function. The ceremonial spaces where tribute was received were supported by mundane spaces where records were kept and resources were stored and the daily work of governance proceeded. The stairs led not just to the Apadana's grandeur but to the offices where scribes counted and recorded, where administrators organized and distributed, where the empire's business was conducted away from the ceremonial display. The spring festival that brought delegations to Persepolis was Nowruz, the Persian New Year celebrated at the spring equinox, the moment when day and night were equal, when winter's death gave way to spring's rebirth, when the year renewed itself and creation began again. The festival was Zoroastrian holy day, was celebration of renewal and triumph of light over darkness, was religious ceremony that Darius made into political theater by requiring that provincial delegations attend, that tribute be presented during the festival, that the renewal of nature be paralleled by the renewal of political submission, that the spring's coming be marked by reaffirmation of imperial unity. Walking the platform where the Apadana stood because the hall itself is ruin now, is columns standing without roof, is space open to sky where once there was covering, we feel the emptiness where splendor was, the silence where ceremony resounded, the absence where power displayed itself. The reliefs remain, showing the eternal procession. The stairs remain, leading to the ruin. The platform remains, elevated above the plain, but the roof has fallen. The treasuries have been plundered. The archives have been burned. The glory has dissolved into the decay that Alexander's conquest initiated, that time completed, that has left only stone testimony to what was built and what was lost. The stairs that ascended to heaven led ultimately to earth again, led through the brief flowering of Persian ceremony and power to the destruction that conquest brought, led from Darius's vision of sacred space to Alexander's decision that Persepolis should burn, led from the moment when empire seemed eternal to the recognition that empire was temporary, that the stairs led not to heaven but to platform that could be destroyed, that the ascent was not divine journey but human construction that served human purposes until humans chose to destroy it, until the stairs led to ruins instead of palace, until the climb ended not in audience with the King of Kings but in contemplation of empty space where throne once stood, where ceremony once created meaning, where the empire once displayed its power through architecture and ritual, through stairs and reliefs. Through the great Apadana where columns still stand like memories of what sheltered beneath them, like ghosts of the hall that was, like stone testimony to the empire that built it and to the empire that destroyed it, to Darius who envisioned it and to Alexander who burned it, to the stairs that ascended toward the sacred and that led ultimately to silence, to the emptiness where heaven was supposed to be, to the ruins where we stand now, 25 centuries later, climbing stairs that laid nowhere. Approaching throne that exists only in absence, participating in ceremony that continues only in stone, ascending toward heaven that was never there, that was always here, that was always merely elevation and architecture and theater of power that made the climb seem meaningful, that made the vertical distance seem like spiritual ascent, that made walking upward feel like approaching the divine, until we reach the top and find not heaven but the plain scene from above. Not God but the space where the king sat, not transcendence but the view, beautiful still, meaningful still in its way. But human, always human, never divine, never heaven, never anything except what Darius built, stairs and platform, and the space where power displayed itself for a time, for a while, until it fell, until the stairs led not to glory but to memory, not to presence but to absence, not to heaven but to the silence that remains when heaven is revealed to have been theater. When ascent is revealed to have been architecture, when the stairs are revealed to lead not upward but simply here to this place, this platform, this empty space where Persepolis stood and where Persepolis fell and where the stairs remain, leading still, climbing still, ascending still toward what no longer exists except in the imagination of those who climb them now, and who understand that the stairs ascended not to heaven but to the idea of heaven. Not to the divine but to power's claim to divine authority, not to eternity but to the temporary glory that Darius created and that time dissolved, leaving only stairs that climb, that ascend, that lead us upward to the recognition that heaven was always just above us, always just out of reach, always the next step, the next level, the next ascent, always ascending, never arriving, climbing forever toward what the stairs promised but could never deliver. And toward the heaven that remains forever above us even as we stand on the highest platform Darius built, even as we reach the top of the stairs, even as we arrive at the place where heaven was supposed to be and find instead the truth that heaven was the climbing, that the ascent was its own purpose, that the stairs were not means to reach somewhere else but were themselves the destination, were themselves the meaning, were themselves the sacred space that Darius created. The stairs that ascended to heaven by making heaven out of the ascent itself, out of the climb that continues even now, even here, even in the ruins, still ascending, still climbing, still reaching upward toward what the stairs forever promise and what the stairs forever withhold, heaven itself. The divine realm, the sacred space that exists only in the ascent, only in the climbing, only in the stairs themselves that ascend forever toward the heaven that is revealed to be not destination but journey. Not place but movement, not arrival but the eternal climbing that the stairs invite, that the stairs enable, that the stairs were built to create, the ascent that is its own heaven, the climbing that is its own sacred act. The stairs that ascend not to somewhere else but to the understanding that heaven is here, in the stairs, in the climbing, in the ascent itself that Darius built and that remains, leading upward, always upward, forever ascending, forever climbing. A forever reaching toward the heaven that is the stairs themselves, the ascent itself, the climbing itself, forever and always, the stairs that ascended to heaven by being heaven, by making heaven out of stone and elevation, and the simple, profound act of climbing upward toward the sky. In the archives at Persepolis, in chambers where clay tablets accumulated like sediment deposited by slow river, where scribes worked in silence broken only by the sound of stylus pressing into soft clay, where dust motes drifted in the light that entered through high windows, the empire recorded itself. Not in monuments that proclaimed glory, not in reliefs that showed conquered peoples climbing stairs, not in the grand proclamations carved into unreachable cliffs, but in mundane documents that counted grain and beer, that tracked workers and rations, that noted every transaction and transfer that kept the vast administrative machine functioning. The Persepolis fortification tablets and the treasury tablets survive in their thousands, are clay documents that administrators discarded into fortress walls when they were no longer needed. Clay that hardened and preserved, clay that emerged 25 centuries later to tell us what monuments never mention. How many jars of wine were distributed to workers on the King's Road? How much grain was transferred from one warehouse to another, which officials received travel rations for journeys to distant provinces, which workers were employed on which construction projects, and for how many days? We sit with the scribe in his chamber. Watch him select a fresh tablet, feel the clay's dampness between his fingers, see him press the wedge-shaped stylus into the surface, creating the cuneiform signs that record the transaction he witnesses. 500 rations of beer distributed to workers on the 10th day of the month. Grain transferred from the warehouse at Shiraz to the warehouse at Persepolis. A messenger receives provisions for journey to Bactria, bread and flour, wine and dried meat, enough for 20 days on the road. The work is routine, is unremarkable, is the kind of record-keeping that any complex organization requires but that rarely survives because it seems unimportant, because once the transaction is complete the record has served its purpose, because monuments celebrate glory while archives preserve only the mundane. But in the mundanity lies truth that monuments conceal, that empire was built not on dramatic gestures but on patient counting, not on heroic conquests but on systematic administration, not on the spectacular but on the routine work of tracking resources and distributing them where they were needed. Darius organized this, systematized the record-keeping, established standards that allowed administrators in different provinces to record information in comparable formats. It created the expectation that everything would be counted, that every transaction would be documented, that the empire's resources would be tracked with precision that made planning possible, that allowed officials to know what was available and what was needed, that transformed governance from improvisation into system. The tablets record diversity that monuments homogenize. The workers receiving rations include not just Persians but Babylonians and Egyptians, Greeks and Indians, men and women, slave and free. The goods being tracked include local products and imports, items produced within the empire and luxuries obtained through trade with territories beyond Persian control. The empire's economic life appears in these documents with specificity that no proclamation provides, appears as network of production and distribution, of labor and compensation, of resources flowing from places of surplus to places of need. The scribes who kept these records were empire's foundation. Were more essential than generals who won battles, more crucial than governors who ruled provinces, more fundamental than even the great king himself, because without the counting nothing else could function. Armies needed supplies, construction projects needed materials and workers, officials needed food and transport, the royal court needed luxuries. All required resources, and resources required tracking, and tracking required scribes who would spend their lives recording transactions that individually were insignificant, but that collectively were empire's substance. The tablets reveal systems' sophistication. To show that administrators tracked not just quantities but qualities, not just that grain was transferred but what kind of grain, not just that workers were employed but what work they performed, not just that rations were distributed but who received them and under what authority. The specificity made accountability possible, made fraud difficult, made the system resistant to the corruption that undermines less carefully organized administrations. But the tablets also reveal systems' limits. Many record minor discrepancies, shortfalls that had to be explained, surpluses that required justification, transfers that were not properly authorized. The system was not perfect, could not prevent all errors or all dishonesty, could only make such problems visible, could only create paper trail that allowed investigation, could only establish expectation that accountability mattered even if accountability could not always be enforced. The scribe is nameless. His tablets bear no personal identification, acknowledge no individual authorship, exist as purely functional documents recording information that mattered only while it was current. When the grain was consumed and the workers were paid and the construction was completed, the tablets that recorded these events lost their administrative value, became waste that could be used as fill material in walls, became the clay that would preserve accidentally what was never meant to be permanent. In the thousands of tablets that survive, in the records of beer rations and grain transfers, in the documentation of workers employed and officials traveling, we find empire's reality beneath empire's rhetoric. Find the daily work that sustained the power. Find the routine that made the spectacular possible. Find the counting that undergirded the conquering. Find the scribes who received no monuments but who made monuments possible, who received no praise but who made praiseworthy achievement achievable, who left no names but whose work left the empire functioning. The genius of Darius appears not just in grand designs, but in recognizing that grand designs required unglamorous support, that organizing empire meant organizing everything including and especially the mundane, that the scribe counting beer rations was as essential as the satrap governing province, that the tablet recording grain transfer was as crucial as the relief showing tributary peoples, that empire was built not just on power proclaimed but on resources tracked. Not just on authority claimed but on accountability established, not just on the visible but on the invisible work that made visible achievements possible. In the silence of the archive, in the chambers where tablets accumulated, in the dusty spaces where clay preserved what was meant to be temporary, empire spoke its truth more honestly than in any monument. Spoke in quantities and dates, in records of distribution and transfer, in the patient counting that never stopped because empire's functioning never stopped. Because workers needed rations and officials needed supplies, and the machine that Darius built required constant feeding, required continuous tracking, required the scribes who counted everything to continue counting, to continue recording, to continue creating the documentary foundation upon which all else rested. The scribe's stylus moved across the clay, pressed the wedge shapes that formed words and numbers. It created the record that would be filed and forgotten and rediscovered millennia later, and studied and translated and made to reveal what it had always contained: the truth that empire was organization, that organization was counting, that counting was the work of scribes who sat in chambers and pressed styluses into clay, and created the unglamorous foundation without which all the glory would collapse, without which armies could not march because supplies would not arrive, without which cities could not function because resources would not be distributed, without which empire could not exist because existence required knowing what you had and where it was and how to move it to where it was needed, required the patient work of counting everything, of recording everything, of making the invisible visible through the simple, profound act of pressing stylus into clay and creating the tablet that said, "On this day, this amount, this transfer, this distribution, this counting that made empire possible, this record that made organization achievable, this scribe who counted everything and thereby made everything count." That through the desert of Egypt, where ancient pharaohs had once attempted similar works, where the sand held memories of waterways that had silted up and failed, where the dream of joining waters had been dreamed before and abandoned as impossible or impractical, Darius ordered the cutting of a canal. Not merely ditch, but was engineering achievement that would connect the Nile River to the Red Sea, that would make possible for the first time passage by ship from the Mediterranean through Egyptian territory to the Indian Ocean, that would link the western and eastern reaches of the empire by water as the royal road linked them by land. The canal was not original vision. Egyptian rulers had built precursors, had created waterways that allowed ships to pass between the Nile and the Red Sea when water levels permitted, when seasonal flooding made depths sufficient, when maintenance had kept channels clear. But these earlier canals had not been sustained, had silted up when attention lapsed, had become impassable when resources were not allocated to continuous dredging, had returned to desert when the will to maintain them failed. Darius rebuilt and expanded what had existed before, applied to the canal the same organizational genius that he applied to everything, systematized the construction, established permanent maintenance systems, created infrastructure that would outlast single reign because it was embedded in administrative structures rather than dependent on individual rulers' commitment. The canal would require continuous attention, but Darius created the systems that could provide that attention across generations. The engineering was substantial. The canal had to cross approximately 100 kilometers of territory, had to be deep enough to accommodate ships drawing several feet of water, had to be wide enough that vessels could pass each other or could turn around if necessary. The excavation moved enormous quantities of earth and stone, required coordinating thousands of workers, required solving problems of surveying and grading, of ensuring that water would flow properly, of preventing the banks from collapsing, of creating locks or controls where needed to manage water levels. The stelae were erected along the canal's length, inscribed in multiple languages: hieroglyphic Egyptian for the local population, cuneiform Persian for the imperial administration, Akkadian for the broader Near Eastern world. The inscriptions proclaimed Darius's achievement, celebrated the moment when ships could sail from Persia through Egypt to distant seas, declared that the great king had accomplished what pharaohs had attempted and failed to sustain. We sail the canal in imagination, feel the current carrying us from the Nile toward the Red Sea, watch the desert sliding past on either bank, see the workers maintaining the channel, observe the ships traveling in both directions carrying goods and messages, and people between the empire's eastern and western territories. The canal makes vivid what maps show abstractly, that the empire extended from sea to sea, that Persian power touched waters separated by land that now could be traversed by water, that distance measured in months of overland travel could be reduced to weeks of sailing. The canal represented mastery over nature. It represented human intelligence and organization imposing will on landscape that resisted modification, that preferred to remain desert, that would revert to desert the moment maintenance ceased. The canal was defiance of natural tendency, was insistence that geography would serve empire rather than empire accepting geographic limitations, was demonstration that Darius's power extended not just over peoples but over the earth itself, over the waterways that could be redirected, over the deserts that could be made to accommodate passage. But the canal also required maintenance, required constant dredging to prevent silting that desert winds and seasonal floods would inevitably cause, required protecting banks against erosion, required workers and resources and attention that had to be sustained across generations because nature's tendency was to undo what humans accomplished, to fill the channel with sand, to reclaim the route that had been carved against natural drainage, and to return water to its accustomed paths and leave the canal dry and useless. When the administrative systems that maintained the canal dissolved, when the empire fell and new rulers chose not to allocate resources to dredging and repair, when attention shifted elsewhere and the canal's utility seemed insufficient to justify its cost, nature reclaimed what had been taken. The silt accumulated, the banks collapsed, the channel filled, the passage closed. The canal that had joined two seas became memory and then became forgotten until modern excavations rediscovered the ancient waterway, until archaeologists found the stelae proclaiming what Darius had built, until the canal's existence could be verified and its route could be traced and its significance could be understood. The canal's history became metaphor for empire itself. was achievement that required continuous effort to maintain, was construction that served vital purpose while systems sustained it, was connection that dissolved when organization failed, was the demonstration that human accomplishment is always temporary unless continuously renewed, that what one generation builds another must maintain or watch dissolve, that the joining of two seas was real achievement, but was achievement that could not be permanent without permanent commitment. In the desert where the canal once ran, where ships once sailed through geography that should not have permitted passage, where the impossible was made possible through organization and will and the systematic application of resources, the sand has returned. The channel has disappeared. The banks have eroded. Only the stele remain, proclaiming in languages few can read that here Darius cut the canal, here ships sailed between seas, here the empire demonstrated its power to reshape the world. The canal speaks to us about ambition and its limits, about achievement and its requirements, about the human capacity to accomplish the remarkable and the human inability to make the remarkable permanent. Speaks about Darius's vision that extended beyond conquering to connecting, beyond defeating enemies to facilitating trade, beyond claiming territories to making territories function together as economic and administrative unity. It speaks about the organizational genius that understood that joining seas required not just cutting canal, but creating systems to maintain canal, that the achievement was not in the initial excavation but in the sustained commitment to keeping the channel open. The canal joined two seas for as long as empire lasted, for as long as organization functioned, for as long as the systems Darius created continued allocating resources to maintenance that nature made necessary. When empire fell, when organization dissolved, when systems failed, the seas returned to separation, the canal returned to desert, the joining became memory of what had been joined, and what had separated again when the will to maintain connection lapsed. In the silence of the desert where water once flowed, where ships once carried the wealth of east to west and west to east, where the canal created passage that made empire's vast extent manageable by making communication and trade possible between territories separated by land but connected by water. The sand whispers about impermanence, about the temporary nature of all human construction, about the canal that joined two seas until it didn't, until it couldn't. Until the joining stopped and separation returned and the canal that had been Darius's achievement became testament to achievement's fragility, to the truth that what we build requires continuous building, that what we accomplish requires continuous accomplishing, that the canal can join two seas only while we maintain the canal, only while we dredge and repair and allocate resources and commit to the work, only while empire lasts, only while organization functions. Only while the will persists to keep the channel open against nature's patient insistence on returning everything to dust, on filling every channel, on separating what humans join, on teaching through the silted canal the lesson that all ruins teach, that we build gloriously and that glory fades, that we accomplish greatly and that accomplishment dissolves, that we join two seas and that the seas separate again when we stop maintaining what we built, when we stop organizing what we organized. When we stop being Darius, when we stop being empire, when we stop being the will that cuts canals through deserts and maintains them against the desert's determination to reclaim what was taken, to fill what was emptied, to separate what was joined, to make the canal into memory, into archaeology, into the whisper in the sand that says, "Once here 2 seas were joined, and for a time ships sailed where now there is only desert, only dust, only the silence where water spoke, only the absence where presence was, only the memory of the canal that joined 2 seas until time end them, until sand filled the channel, until the impossible achievement that Darius made possible became impossible again, became the dream that was realized and that dissolved, became the canal that existed and that ceased existing, became the joining that separated. It became the connection that broke, became the achievement that failed not because it was poorly done, but because achievement requires maintenance and maintenance requires empire and empire requires the organization that Darius created and that could not be sustained forever, that functioned for a time and then failed, that maintained the canal for generations and then let it silt up, that joined 2 seas for as long as empire lasted and then allowed separation to return when empire fell. When the canal that Darius cut became the desert that Darius had briefly defeated, when the joining that required continuous effort ceased to receive that effort, when the 2 seas that had been connected returned to separation, when the canal became memory, became archaeology, became testament to what was achieved and what was lost, to what was joined and what separated, to the canal that once was and that no longer is except in the traces that remain, in the stelae that proclaim. In the sand that fills where water flowed, in the desert that has reclaimed what the canal briefly conquered, in the silence where ships once sailed, in the emptiness where connection was, in the absence that testifies to presence, in the memory of the canal that joined 2 seas. On the plain at Marathon where rocky hills descended to the sea, where the distance from Athens was just 26 miles, the distance a messenger would run to bring news of victory, the distance that would become immortalized in the athletic race that bears the battlefield's name, the margin appeared. Not geographic margin, not the frontier line marked on maps, not the boundary where one territory ended and another began, but conceptual margin, the limit beyond which Persian power could not extend, the place where empire that had seemed unlimited encountered resistance it could not overcome. The year was 490 BCE, 8 years into Darius's effort to punish Athens and Eretria for their support of the Ionian revolt, for their temerity in burning Sardis, for their challenge to Persian authority over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. The Persian force that landed at Marathon was not the empire's full strength, was expeditionary force of perhaps 20,000 men, transported by fleet, commanded by generals who expected that numerical superiority and battle experience would bring swift victory over the 10,000 Athenian hoplites who arrayed themselves to defend their homeland. The battle was brief. The Athenians charged. The Persian center gave way, but the wings held. The Greek wings encircled the Persian center. The Persian army broke, fled to the ships, left thousands dead on the field, the Athenians lost fewer than 200 men. The disproportionate losses testified to the effectiveness of Greek tactics, to the advantage that heavily armored hoplites fighting in close formation possessed against lighter-armed Persian infantry, to the determination of men fighting for their homes against soldiers fighting for empire and plunder. The battle itself was not catastrophic, for Persia was defeat in single engagement, was loss of relatively small force, was setback that did not threaten empire's core territories or shake its fundamental stability. But Marathon was symbolically profound. Was first time that Greek forces had met Persian army in set-piece battle and had won decisively. It was demonstration that Persian forces were not invincible, that the empire could be resisted, that the great king's armies could be defeated by free citizens fighting in defense of their liberty. The defeat whispered what later battles would shout, that empire had limits, that expansion could not continue indefinitely, that there were peoples who would resist regardless of cost, that military superiority in resources and numbers did not guarantee victory against determined opponents fighting on their own territory with tactics suited to their strengths. Marathon revealed that the organizational genius that had created the largest empire the world had yet seen had encountered something it could not organize away: the fierce independence of peoples who preferred death to submission. Darius would never forgive Marathon, would spend the remaining years of his reign preparing invasion that would complete what Marathon left unfinished, that would punish Athens properly, that would demonstrate that Persian defeat had been anomaly rather than harbinger. The preparations were massive, required building fleet of hundreds of ships, assembling army of hundreds of thousands of men, organizing logistics to support force larger than any previously assembled, creating supply lines that could sustain invasion across the Aegean, planning coordination between naval and land forces across distances where communication was difficult. But Darius would die in 486 BCE, 4 years after Marathon, without launching the invasion he planned. The work would fall to his son Xerxes, who would lead the great expedition in 480 BCE, who would bridge the Hellespont and march through Thrace and Macedonia, who would defeat the Spartans at Thermopylae but would lose the fleet at Salamis, whose land army would be crushed at Plataea, who would retreat having accomplished nothing except demonstrating definitively what Marathon had suggested, that Greek resistance could not be overcome through force, that the margin that appeared at Marathon was real. That empire's expansion westward had reached its limit. The margin was not failure of organization. Darius's preparations for the Greek invasion demonstrated organizational sophistication that would have impressed any observer. The logistics were carefully planned. The resources were adequately allocated. The coordination was as good as contemporary technology allowed. The margin appeared not because Darius failed to organize, but because organization alone could not guarantee victory, because military success required not just superior numbers and careful planning, but also terrain that favored your tactics and opponents who would break rather than fight to death, and political situations that made conquest sustainable once achieved. The Greeks possessed none of the advantages that made other territories vulnerable to Persian conquest. Their mountainous geography favored defense. Their political fragmentation meant no single defeat would conquer all of them. Their military tactics were specifically adapted to their terrain and their social structure. Their fierce attachment to independence made them willing to sacrifice everything rather than submit. The margin that appeared at Marathon was not line on map, but was the recognition that some peoples could not be conquered at acceptable cost, that some territories would resist so effectively that holding them would drain more resources than they provided. Standing on the plain at Marathon where Persian dead were buried in a mound that still rises from the earth, where Athenian dead received honors that made them heroes, where the margin became visible through the simple fact of Greek victory against superior numbers, we contemplate what it means for empire to encounter its limits. The limit was not geographic. Persia would maintain control over Greek cities in Asia Minor, would continue to influence Greek affairs through diplomacy and gold if not through direct military conquest. The limit was conceptual, was recognition that empire could not expand indefinitely, that there were margins beyond which extension was impractical, that the organizing genius that made vast territories governable could not make all territories governable. The margin whispered what Darius perhaps already knew, but what Marathon made undeniable, that empire was achievement but was also burden, that every conquest created new frontiers that required defending, that expansion created administrative challenges that even sophisticated organizations struggled to meet, that the size that made empire impressive also made empire vulnerable. That the vast extent that Darius ruled effectively from Aegean to Indus was approaching the limits of what ancient technology and organization could manage. Marathon taught that power has limits, that organization has limits, that even the most sophisticated administrative systems cannot overcome every obstacle, that empire could not simply continue expanding until it encompassed the entire world. That margins existed, physical margins where geography made conquest impractical, political margins where resistance was too fierce, economic margins where costs exceeded benefits, organizational margins where distance and diversity strained systems beyond their capacity. In the dust at Marathon, in the mound where Persian dead lie buried far from home, in the plain where empire learned it could be defeated, the margin speaks still, speaks about limits and their importance. It speaks about the wisdom of recognizing what cannot be achieved rather than pursuing impossible goals. Speaks about Darius, who organized brilliantly but who also understood or learned at Marathon that organization was tool with limits, that empire was achievement with boundaries, that the great king could rule from sea to sea but could not rule every sea, could organize vast territories but could not organize everything, could create systems that functioned across enormous distances but could not create systems that functioned everywhere. The margin that appeared at Marathon was lesson that Darius's successors would learn more painfully, that empire ends somewhere, that expansion has limits, that the organizing genius that created the Persian Empire encountered at Marathon the margin where genius was insufficient, where organization could not overcome resistance, where empire learned through defeat that it could not have everything, that some territories would remain beyond reach, that some peoples would remain unconquered, that the margin was real. Was meaningful, was limit that had to be acknowledged even if it could not be accepted, even if the great king would spend his final years preparing to push beyond it. Even if Xerxes would lead the greatest invasion ancient world had yet seen in attempt to erase the margin, even if the margin would persist, would prove real, would demonstrate that empire ends somewhere, that organization has limits, that the margin exists, that Marathon revealed it. That the dust of that plain holds the truth that every empire eventually learns that power ends, that expansion stops, that the margin appears, that empire encounters its limit, that the world cannot be entirely organized, entirely ruled, entirely conquered, that somewhere empire ends and the margin begins, that Marathon was where Darius's empire found that margin, where the limit appeared, where the expansion stopped. Where the organizing genius that had created so much encountered what it could not create, could not organize, could not overcome the margin, the limit, the place where empire ended and where something else began, something that empire could not control, could not organize, could not rule, something that remained beyond the margin, beyond the limit, beyond the reach even of Darius, who organized everything else, who created systems that ruled territories of unprecedented extent, who built empire that would be remembered as organizational triumph, but who learned at Marathon that organization had limits, that empire had margins, that power ended somewhere, that the somewhere was here at Marathon, where the margin appeared, where empire stopped, where the limit was revealed, where Darius's vision of unlimited expansion encountered the reality of limited possibility, where the organizing genius met its match, where empire learned it could not have everything. Where the margins spoke and said, "Here, this far, no farther, this is the limit, this is where empire ends, this is Marathon, this is the margin, this is where expansion stops and where something else begins, the recognition of limits, the acknowledgement of margins, the understanding that even Darius, even the great king, even the organizer of empire, could not organize everything, could not rule everywhere, could not extend power infinitely, could not push the margin beyond Marathon, beyond the place where it appeared. Beyond the limit that it revealed, beyond the margin where empire ended. When Darius died in 486 BCE, his body prepared for burial according to customs that mixed Persian tradition with royal innovation. His tomb carved into the cliff at Naksh Rustam, where it would overlook the plain for millennia. His reign concluded, but his legacy waiting to be carried forward by the son who would inherit everything Darius had built. The throne passed not merely through biological descent, but through careful political preparation. Through years of planning that had made the succession as orderly as empire's administration, that had transformed inheritance from moment of crisis into ritual of continuity. Xerxes was not Darius's eldest son, was not first in line by simple chronology, but Xerxes was born after Darius became king, was born in the purple, as later ages would say, carried legitimacy that came from royal birth rather than from birth to man who would become king. The distinction mattered in ways that modern sensibilities might find strange, but that made perfect sense in ancient context where legitimacy was contested, where multiple sons might claim inheritance, where succession could plunge empire into civil war if not carefully managed. Darius had seized power through combination of force and political maneuvering, had claimed throne that was not obviously his by birth, had spent early years of his reign establishing legitimacy through achievement and through proclamation carved into cliff faces. For his sons he arranged differently, ensured that inheritance would not require justification, that succession would be smooth transfer of power from father to designated heir, that empire would not fragment because multiple claimants contested throne. The succession carried Darius's name forward into the next generation. Xerxes would rule as Xerxes the Great King, but he would also rule as Darius's son, as the heir to the systems Darius created, as the inheritor of the organizational genius that had transformed conquered territories into administered empire. The name Darius would be carved into Xerxes' inscriptions, would be invoked in the legitimation formulas, would connect the new reign to the previous reign, would create continuity that made change seem less dramatic than it was. But succession also revealed empire's vulnerability. All the organization, all the systems, all the careful planning that Darius had implemented depended ultimately on the person who inherited them. Empire was not yet institution that could function independently of emperor. Was still personal creation of the great king who ruled it. When great king died, everything depended on whether heir was capable of continuing the work, whether he understood the systems he inherited, whether he possessed the wisdom to use organization's tools effectively. Xerxes would prove capable administrator, would maintain the systems Darius created, would even expand and refine them in certain areas. But Xerxes would also lead the disastrous invasion of Greece that Darius had planned, would see Persian forces defeated at Salamis and Plataea in battles more decisive than Marathon, would demonstrate that empire's organizational genius could not guarantee military success, that the systems Darius created were tools that could be used well or poorly, that succession transferred power but could not transfer the genius that had created what power ruled. The succession carved Darius's name into history not just through Xerxes continuing his administrative work but through Xerxes revealing its limits. The son completed what the father began and thereby showed that what began in triumph could end in failure. The systems Darius created were necessary but not sufficient. The organization was impressive but not invincible. The empire could be ruled effectively across generations, but could also be threatened by challenges that organization alone could not overcome. In the tomb at Naksh Rustem, where Darius lies, tomb carved into cliff face in cruciform pattern, showing the great king standing on platforms supported by representatives of subject peoples, showing the winged figure of Ahura Mazda hovering above, showing the eternal imagery of Persian kingship made permanent in stone, we contemplate what succession means. The tomb speaks of Darius's reign and its achievements, but the tomb is also a reminder that reign ended, that even great king died, that succession was necessary because power could not remain in one person's hands forever. The cliff at Naksh Rustam holds 4 such tombs: Darius and 3 of his successors, all carved in similar pattern, all proclaiming similar authority, all claiming similar divine favor. The repetition creates sequence, creates dynasty, creates sense that Persian kingship continued across generations, that what Darius built was sustained by those who came after. But the tombs also reveal the limits of succession's capacity to transfer excellence along with power. The empire that Xerxes inherited was empire at its height. The empire that later kings ruled was empire in slow decline. The systems Darius created persisted but weakened. The organization functioned but with decreasing effectiveness. The genius was not hereditary. The succession that carved Darius's name into history carved it also into the record of empire's rise and eventual fall, carved it into the story of organizational triumph and organizational limits. Carved it into the recognition that what one generation builds may be maintained by next generation but may also begin to decay, may be used by successor for purposes original builder did not intend, may reveal through continued existence both the strength of original design and the weakness of any design that depends on human implementation, that requires continuous wisdom and effort and attention to function as intended. Xerxes inherited empire at its zenith. Inherited systems that functioned smoothly, inherited resources that seemed limitless, inherited prestige that made Persian power appear unchallengeable. But Xerxes also inherited problems that Darius had not solved: the Greek question that Marathon had made urgent, the balance between satrapies and center that required constant attention, the tension between diversity and unity that organization managed but could not eliminate. The inheritance was mixed, as all inheritances are. Was achievement and challenge both? Was success requiring defense and maintenance? Was empire needing not just to be ruled but to be sustained against forces internal and external that would undermine it? The succession carved Darius's name not into immortality but into the historical sequence where reigns follow each other, where builders are succeeded by maintainers who are succeeded by presiders over decline, where the brilliant beginning gives way to the competent middle that gives way to the troubled end, where empire rises and peaks and falls, where succession connects the peak to what came before and to what came after. Where Darius's organizational genius created the systems that made the peak possible, and where the peak could not be sustained indefinitely because succession transfers power but cannot transfer genius, transfers systems but cannot transfer the insight that created systems, transfers empire but cannot transfer whatever made empire possible in first place: the particular combination of vision and will and circumstance that allowed Darius to organize what others had conquered, and to systematize what others had assembled, to create from the chaos of succession crisis and rebellion the order of administered empire, the structure of sustainable governance, the organization that would persist for 2 centuries before Alexander destroyed it, that would function across generations before functions decayed, that would demonstrate both what human organization could achieve and what organization could not sustain, what succession could transfer and what succession would lose. What Darius created and what came after, what was built and what was inherited and what was eventually lost when succession finally transferred power to hands that could not hold it. When organization finally failed, when empire finally fell, when the name Darius carved into succession's record became name carved into memory's cliff, permanent like the tomb at Naksh Rustam, testifying like the carved stone to what was and what ended. A terrain that built and succession that continued and decline that came despite organization, despite systems, despite the genius that created both but that could not be passed to successors who inherited power but not the vision, who maintained systems but did not understand their purpose, who ruled empire but lost the understanding that made empire possible, that made organization effective, that made Darius's name into the name we remember when we remember Persian organizational genius. When we think of empire administered effectively, when we contemplate what it means to build systems that outlast their builder but that cannot outlast indefinitely, that function while maintained but that decay when maintenance fails, that survive succession but cannot survive every succession, that transfer power but cannot transfer understanding, that carve the name into succession's record where it testifies to what was built and to what inheritance means, and to what limits succession reveals about human achievement that depends on particular persons who die and whose genius dies with them even while their systems persist for a time. For a while, for generations maybe, but not forever, never forever, only until succession transfers power one time too many, one generation too far, into hands that cannot hold what Darius built, that cannot maintain what Darius organized, that watched the slow decline that succession made inevitable when it transferred empire from builder to inheritor, from creator to maintainer, from Darius to Xerxes and beyond, into the succession that carved Darius's name but that also carved empire's trajectory from rise to peak to decline, from organization to maintenance to decay. And from the genius that built to the succession that inherited to the decline that came despite everything Darius did to prevent it, despite the systems he created, despite the organization he established, despite the name he carved into succession's record, into history's memory, into the cliff at Naksh Rustam where it testifies still to the great king who organized empire and whose succession carried his organization forward for a time, for a while, until succession's limits appeared. Until inheritance proved insufficient, until empire learned that genius cannot be transferred, that organization requires continuous creation, not merely continuous maintenance, that succession carves names but cannot carve the understanding that made names worth carving, that Darius was Darius and Xerxes was Xerxes, and though son followed father and empire continued, something was lost in succession, something that organization needed, something that genius provided. Something that could not be inherited along with throne and systems and empire itself, the vision, the insight, the particular intelligence that saw chaos and organized it, that saw empire and administered it, that saw succession approaching and prepared for it, but could not prevent succession from revealing that what Darius built could be inherited but could not be fully sustained, could be maintained but could not be recreated, could survive him but could not survive indefinitely, could transfer through succession once, twice, several times, but would eventually encounter the successor who lacked what succession could not give, who inherited power but not vision, who became king but not builder, who ruled but did not organize, who maintained until maintenance was not enough, until systems required renewal that successors could not provide, until empire needed what succession could not transfer, needed Darius again, needed the organizing genius that had created empire, needed what had been lost when succession carved Darius's name into history and separated the name from the person, the reputation from the reality, the inheritance from the achievement, the successor from the builder, Xerxes from Darius, the one who inherited from the one who created, forever separated by succession, forever connected by empire, forever bound by the name carved into history, into succession, into the record that says, Darius built, Xerxes inherited, empire continued, genius died, succession happened, time passed, decline came, empire fell, names remained, carved into history, testifying still. Throughout the empire's vast extent, across territories where peoples practiced customs as diverse as the landscapes they inhabited, where laws varied from province to province, and what was permitted in one place was forbidden in another, where tradition shaped behavior in ways that written codes could never capture, Darius established principle that echoed across centuries, though it was never carved into monuments, never proclaimed from cliff faces, never celebrated in the reliefs showing tributary peoples ascending stairs at Persepolis. The principle was simple but revolutionary, that local laws should be respected, that empire's unity did not require uniformity, that peoples could maintain traditional ways while submitting to Persian authority. The principle appeared not in what Darius said, but in what he did not say, appeared in the absence of proclamations demanding conformity, appeared in the silence where other empires issued orders requiring subject peoples to abandon their gods and customs, appeared in the space that Darius left for diversity to persist within framework of imperial order. The law that spoke in silence was visible through its effects. In Babylon, where Darius honored Marduk and participated in traditional ceremonies, where he presented himself not as foreign conqueror, but as legitimate king chosen by the city's own gods. In Egypt, where he respected ancient customs and supported temples, where he allowed priests to maintain traditional practices and even commissioned temple construction. In Judea, where he permitted exiles to return and rebuild Jerusalem's temple, where he allowed worship of Yahweh to continue under Persian protection. In Greek cities of Asia Minor, where he allowed self-governance in local matters while requiring acknowledgement of Persian sovereignty in matters of tribute and foreign policy. The silence was strategic, was recognition that empire's strength came from allowing diversity to persist, that attempting to impose uniformity across territories so vast would create resentment and resistance, that respecting local customs made rule more stable and less costly than forcing change would have been. But the silence was also pragmatic, was understanding that Persian ways could not be imposed on peoples so numerous and so diverse, that administrative capacity did not extend to regulating every aspect of life in every province, that the empire functioned more efficiently by allowing local laws to govern local affairs while reserving for central authority only matters that affected imperial interests. The law that spoke in silence created space for peoples to remain themselves within Persian Empire, created possibility that Egyptian could continue being Egyptian while acknowledging Persian authority, that Babylonian could worship Babylonian gods while submitting to Persian king, that Greek could maintain Greek customs while accepting Persian control over foreign relations and tribute collection. The space was not unlimited, was bounded by requirement of submission, by need to pay taxes, by prohibition against rebellion. But within those boundaries, considerable autonomy existed. We listened to this silence, to what was not said, to the absence of demands for uniformity, to the space that Darius left for diversity to flourish within empire's framework. The silence was administrative policy more than ideological statement, was never proclaimed as principle, because proclaiming it would have made explicit what worked better remaining implicit, would have made into rigid rule what functioned better as flexible practice, would have transformed strategic accommodation into binding promise that could not be adjusted to circumstances. The silence preserved hierarchy while practicing flexibility. A preserved Persian claim to superiority in the reliefs showing tributary peoples approaching the great king. Persian dress and customs were standard against which others were measured. Persian authority was supreme. But the silence also acknowledged that superiority in power did not require uniformity in practice, that peoples could differ in customs while sharing submission to imperial authority, that diversity could coexist with hierarchy within framework Darius created. But the silence also could not be too loud, could not be proclaimed as principle without seeming to admit that Persian ways were not superior enough to be imposed universally, that empire recognized limits to its cultural authority even while claiming unlimited political authority. The tension between claiming superiority and practicing tolerance was resolved through silence, through allowing tolerance to exist in practice while maintaining superiority in rhetoric, through respecting local laws in administration while displaying Persian supremacy in monuments. The law that spoke in silence was law that could be modified, could be applied differently in different contexts, could allow more autonomy to some provinces than to others. It could adjust to circumstances without being bound by explicit promises. The silence gave Darius flexibility that proclamation would have limited, allowed him to respect local customs when respect served imperial interests, but to override those customs when imperial interests required it. The silence was not commitment to tolerance as principle, but was tolerance as policy, as strategy, as administrative approach that made empire more manageable. In the quietness of this policy, in what Darius chose not to proclaim, in the absence of demands for cultural conformity that characterized other empires, we find wisdom born from pragmatism. Wisdom that understood forcing change was expensive, that resistance to cultural domination could be as fierce as resistance to political conquest. That allowing peoples to maintain their identities while submitting to imperial authority was more sustainable than requiring cultural transformation along with political submission. The law that spoke in silence remains largely silent in historical record, is visible mainly through effects through the absence of revolts triggered by cultural oppression, through the continuation of local customs under Persian rule, through the diversity that persisted within imperial framework. It is visible through what did not happen as much as through what did happen, through the rebellions that did not erupt because peoples were not forced to abandon their gods and customs, through the stability that came from not demanding what would have been refused. The silence teaches what proclamations often miss, that power is most effective when it does not insist on everything it could demand, that empire can be sustained more easily through accommodation than through domination, that diversity can be organized rather than eliminated, that law that allows rather than commands may bind more securely than law that prohibits and requires, that what speaks in silence may speak more profoundly than what proclaims itself from every cliff and monument. The silence was Darius's gift to his empire, was the space he left for peoples to be themselves while belonging to something larger, was the tolerance that came not from modern humanitarian concern, but from ancient understanding that empires ruling diverse populations must accommodate diversity or face continuous rebellion, was the wisdom that let local laws speak in provinces while ensuring that imperial law spoke loudly where it mattered, in matters of sovereignty and tribute and submission. Was the balance between respecting difference and maintaining authority, was the law that spoke in silence and that made silence speak more eloquently than proclamation could have, that created through absence rather than presence, through what was not said rather than through what was declared, through the silence that Darius chose to maintain rather than through the proclamations he chose to carve, through the law that was never written down because writing it would have made it rigid, would have made it promise rather than policy, would have made it binding in ways that flexibility required it remain unbound, that made the law that spoke in silence into law that could adapt, could change, could be applied differently as circumstances required, could be the organizing principle that was never proclaimed as principle, could be the tolerance that was never celebrated as tolerance, could be the wisdom that appeared as silence, as absence, as the space that Darius left for diversity to flourish within empire's unity, and for local laws to function within imperial framework, for peoples to remain themselves while becoming Persian subjects, for difference to persist while submission was secured, for silence to speak louder than proclamation, for the law to teach through what it did not say, through what Darius chose not to carve into cliffs, not to proclaim from platforms, not to declare through official channels, but simply to practice, to allow, to maintain through silence, through the absence that created space. Through the law that spoke without speaking, that governed without commanding, that organized through allowing rather than through requiring, that made Darius's empire into place where diversity could exist, where local laws could function, where silence could speak, where the law that was never proclaimed became law that defined how empire functioned, how peoples lived, how organization accommodated diversity, how Darius ruled without requiring uniformity, and how empire sustained itself through the wisdom of the law that spoke in silence. In the silence that has claimed the empire, in the ruins where Persepolis once stood in glory, in the empty stations along the royal road, in the desert where the canal has returned to dust, in all the spaces where Darius's organization once functioned and where only echoes remain, something persists. Not the empire itself, which fell to Alexander's conquest. Not the systems themselves, which dissolved or were transformed beyond recognition. Not the physical structures, most of which have crumbled into archaeological fragments. What persists is echo, is the memory of how Darius organized chaos into order, is the pattern he created, is the model he established, is the understanding he demonstrated about what it means to build empire, to administer territories, to create structures that can persist across generations. The echo-organized silence gave shape to what history left unspoken, created pattern from fragments, allowed later ages to recognize in Darius's achievement something worth remembering, something worth studying, something worth attempting to understand and perhaps to emulate. The echo said, large territories require organization. Diverse peoples require systems that accommodate diversity. Empire requires not just conquest but administration. A power requires not just taking but maintaining. Achievement requires not just initial success but sustained effort across time. The echo reached Roman administrators who studied Persian satrap system when organizing their own provinces, reached Islamic caliphs who inherited Persian bureaucratic traditions when they conquered territories that had been Persian, reached every empire that followed and that learned consciously or unconsciously from the model Darius created. The learning was not always direct, was not always acknowledged, but the patterns persisted. The division into provinces governed by appointed officials, the system of roads and communications, the standardized currency, the balance between central authority and local autonomy, the recognition that empire requires organization as much as military force. But the echo also carried warning, carried the understanding that systems decay, that organization requires continuous maintenance, that what one generation builds another must sustain or watch dissolve, that empire's greatness is measured not by territory conquered but by duration of effective governance, that expansion has limits, that diversity creates tensions that organization can manage but cannot eliminate, that succession can transfer power but cannot transfer genius. The echo organized silence by making absence speak, by making the gap between Darius's achievement and empire's eventual fall into instruction about impermanence, by transforming historical fact into meditation on what humans can build and what time ultimately claims, by creating meaning from the space where empire once stood but where empire stands no longer. In the silence of the ruined capital, in the empty stairs that laid nowhere, in the platform where the Padana's columns stand without roof, in the desert where the royal road has been lost to sand, in the cliff where proclamations speak in languages few can read, the echo persists, organizes the silence into meaning, makes the absence testify to what presence was, makes the ruins speak about what stood here before ruin came, makes the fragments teach about the whole they once composed. The echo says that Darius was organizer of empire, that he transformed conquered territories into administered provinces, that he created systems enabling governance across distances that should have made governance impossible, that he built infrastructure connecting diverse peoples into functioning unity, that he established standards allowing economic activity across vast territories, that he balanced central control with local autonomy in ways that made empire sustainable across generations. The echo says also that organization was mortal, that systems eventually failed, that the empire Darius built so carefully fell despite everything he did to sustain it, that genius could not be institutionalized, that structures could not preserve themselves without continuous renewal, that what was organized eventually dissolved back into chaos from which organization had temporarily rescued it. The silence that the echo organizes is silence of fallen empire, is the quiet that claims all human institutions when time exhausts them, is the absence that remains when presence ends, is the space where organization once functioned, but where organization functions no more. The silence is complete. No messengers run along the royal road, no fires burn in the abandoned temples, no scribes count in the empty archives, no satraps govern the dissolved provinces, no great king sits on the vacant throne, no delegations climb the stairs that lead only to ruins, no ships sail the silted canal, no coins bear the Archer King's image except in museums. No proclamations issue from the dissolved center, no organization organizes, no empire stands where empire stood. But the echo organizes even this silence, makes it speak, makes it teach, makes it testify about what Darius built and what building means and what limits all building faces. The echo says that organization is necessary but temporary, that systems serve but do not survive, that empire rises and falls but that the rising teaches something about human capacity, that the falling teaches something about human limitation, that both together the rising and the falling, the building and the dissolution, the organization and the entropy that undoes organization speak about what it means to be human, to build despite knowing that what we build will fall. And to organize despite knowing that organization will dissolve, to create systems despite knowing that systems will fail, to be Darius who organized empire knowing or perhaps not knowing but discovering that the organization could not last forever, that genius dies, that succession transfers power but loses vision, that time claims everything, that silence comes eventually, that the echo is what remains when everything else is gone. The echo organizing silence is gift that Darius gave unintentionally, is the pattern that persists after empire falls, is the model that survives the thing modeled, is the understanding that outlasts the understanding's original context, is the teaching that continues teaching across millennia, is the voice that speaks from ruins, from absence, from silence, is the organization that organizes even its own dissolution into meaning, that makes even failure instructive, that transforms even fall into lesson. We listen to this echo organizing silence. You hear it speaking softly about empire and its limits, about organization and its mortality, about Darius who built brilliantly and whose building eventually crumbled, about systems that functioned and that ceased functioning, about the empire that was organized so carefully and that dissolved so completely, about the silence that remains when organization stops, about the echo that persists when empire falls, about the voice that continues speaking across the centuries saying, "This is what Darius built, this is how it functioned, this is why it mattered, this is how it fell, this is what remains, this is the echo organizing silence, this is the pattern visible in ruins, this is the teaching that survives the empire that taught it, this is the understanding that persists across 25 centuries. This is what we learn from Darius and his organization and his empire and its fall, that building matters even though buildings fall, that organizing matters even though organization dissolves, that creating systems matters even though systems fail, that Darius's achievement was real even though achievement proved temporary, that the genius was genuine even though genius could not prevent eventual decline, that empire rose high even though empire fell completely, that organization functioned well even though organization ceased functioning, that all this, the rising and the falling, the organizing and the dissolving, the achievement and the eventual failure, speaks together as echo organizing silence. As voice making meaning from absence, as pattern visible in fragments, as teaching that comes from ruins, as understanding that emerges from contemplating what was built and what remains, what was organized and what dissolved, what Darius created and what time claimed, what persists and what is lost, what the echo says and what the silence teaches, what organizing can accomplish and what organizing cannot prevent, what empire can achieve and what empire cannot sustain. What Darius was and what Darius remains, the organizer whose organization fell but whose organizing genius persists in echo, in memory, in the pattern that we recognize when we study ruins, when we contemplate fragments, when we listen to silence and hear it organized into meaning by the echo that Darius left unintentionally, the echo that survives empire, the echo that persists across centuries, the echo that speaks still, that organizes still. That makes silence speak still about what was and what remains, about empire that was organized and empire that fell, about Darius who was builder and whose building dissolved, about the echo that organizes silence, that gives silence meaning, that makes absence present, that allows us to see across millennia the outline of what stood here, the shadow of empire Darius organized, the ghost of systems he created. The memory of organization that functioned brilliantly for a time and then ceased functioning but left behind the echo, left behind the teaching, left behind the pattern that persists when empire has dissolved, left behind the voice that speaks from silence, left behind the meaning that emerges from absence, left behind the understanding that Darius gave us without meaning to give it, the understanding that comes from studying what he built and seeing both its achievement and its limits. Both its glory and its fall, both the organization and the entropy, both the empire and the echo, both the building and the ruin, both the voice and the silence, both what persists and what is lost, both what the echo says and what the silence teaches, forever organized, forever speaking, forever the echo that organizes silence, that makes meaning from absence, that allows Darius to teach across millennia about empire, about organization, about achievement, about limits, about what we can build and what we cannot sustain, about what persists and what dissolves, about the echo and the silence, about organization and entropy, about the great king who organized empire and whose organization eventually failed but whose echo persists, organizing silence, giving absence meaning, speaking still across the ruins, across the centuries, across the space where empire stood and where empire fell, speaking the truth that only echoes can speak, the truth that only silence can teach. The truth that only ruins can reveal, that we build knowing it will fall, that we organize knowing it will dissolve, that we create knowing it will be destroyed, that we are Darius knowing we are mortal, that our empire is temporary, that our systems will fail, that our organization will cease, that silence will come, that the echo will be all that remains, organizing silence forever.